Today, let's talk about why housing prices shower despite COVID. I'm Edward Yu, Associate Professor, University of Auckland. First of all, from figure 1, you will find that the median housing prices in New Zealand increased by 19.8% year on year in October 2020. It is one of the largest price surges in the world. However, the sudden common rebound of house prices in most of the developed economies during the pandemic is mind-blowing as the economies are encountering unprecedented recessions. As the rebounds are almost synchronized after the outbreak of the pandemic, it provides a natural experiment to test the alternative hypothesis on the causes of house price changes. Here in figure 1, I compare the house price changes in 6 countries. They are Australia, Canada, European Union, New Zealand, the UK, and the US. All the 6 economies record strong growth in house prices from 4.5% in Australia, 3.9% in Canada, 5.2% in EU, 5.7% in the US, 7.6% in the UK, and 19.8% in New Zealand. Many of these economies were facing a downward or leveling off trend of their house prices before the pandemic, but then their house prices suddenly rebound like a synchronized switching after the outbreak of the pandemic. It suggests a common cause behind. We have heard of many explanations for the house price rally in New Zealand. In fact, the 4 most common suggest reasons in the past are: first, economic growth; second, insufficient housing supply; third, migrants and return of Kiwis; and fourth, monetary policy. But there's no consensus even among policymakers. For example, our Finance Minister Grant Robinson wrote to Reserve Bank Governor Adrian Orr, suggesting that it is the monetary policy that causes the surge. Although Orr admitted that the Reserve Bank's monetary policy-led decline in interest rates has contributed to the rise in house prices, he refers to previous government studies that housing supply is the most significant determinant of house price. So now, let's go into the 4 hypotheses one by one. The first one, economic growth hypothesis. First, the economic growth hypothesis can largely be refuted as the whole world is facing an unprecedented recession with the deepest year-on-year plummet of the gross domestic product, GDP, in most of the developed countries. Figure 2 here indicates a nearly uniform fall in GDP across all the 6 economies in quarter 2 and quarter 3 of 2020, except New Zealand that got a tiny 0.4% growth in quarter 3 after a punch of negative 12.4% in the previous quarter. The economic repercussions of the coronavirus pandemic are expected to be long-lasting, according to the World Bank report in 2020. It makes little economic sense to explain the recent house prices increase by expected GDP growth. Then let's go into hypothesis 2, that is housing supply hypothesis. The insufficient housing supply hypothesis is also untenable in this cross-country comparison because on one hand, it is impossible to contend that Suddenly, all these developed economies are reverting from oversupply to undersupply at the same time. And on the other hand, New Zealand, for example, is having a continuous strong growth in housing supply in recent years. In fact, we achieved to increase continuously numbers of new private dwellings since 2012, and its growth rate surpasses that of the increase in number of households as shown in figures here. The blue line represents the number of household changes year on year, while the orange line refers to the number of private dwellings year on year change. So you will find that in recent year, the number of private dwellings more than number of households. In the latest statistics, there are 1.9376 million private dwellings accommodating 1.8023 million households in the end of September 2020, meaning that there are 7.5% unoccupied dwellings or non-household occupied dwellings. Better still, the number of new dwellings consented has been increasing from 26,382 in 2015 to 37,981 in 2020, which is the figure in the end of October 2020. Then, how about hypothesis 3? The migrant hypothesis. Similarly, the migrant hypothesis can also be eliminated by the global comparative study as the major reason that attract migrants' return during the pandemic is said to be the success of flattening the COVID curve in New Zealand. In contrast, the situations in the US, the UK, Canada, and Europe are still very bad. For example, at the time of this writing, there are 223,570 confirmed new cases in the US, 20,964 new confirmed cases in the UK, and 6,714 confirmed new cases in Canada. The strong increases in house prices in these countries cannot be attributed to migrants' returns. Furthermore, since the Overseas Investment Amendment Act came into effect in late October 2018, non-residents are restricted from buying residential land and existing properties in New Zealand. According to the Statistics New Zealand 2020 report, that the percentage of residential properties sold to non-citizen or non-resident buyers plunged from 3.3% in March 2018 to 0.6% in September 2020, and is now less than their sellers. So here the orange line refers to the number of non-residents and non-citizens sellers, while the blue line represents the non-residents and non-citizen buyers. So after the enactment of the new law, now the non-citizens and non-residents sellers are more than the non-citizen and non-resident buyer. The last hypothesis, the real interest rate hypothesis. In contrast, cutting interest rate to historic lows is a synchronized response of most of the central banks to COVID-19. According to Deloitte report in 2020, the central bank's interest rate cuts in some of the developed countries in early 2020 are shown in Figure 5. And here you will find that, for example, in Australia, before the COVID pandemic, the central bank's interest rate was 0.75%. Then it was cut substantially down to 0.25%. Similarly, in Canada, before the COVID, it was 1.75%, but then it was sharply cut to just 0.25%. And in New Zealand, similarly, it was cut from 1% to 0.25%, and in the UK, from 0.75% down to 0.1%. In the US, from 1.75% down to 0.25%. While in EU, because before the COVID, it was already in the negative interest rate zone, so they could not further cut their interest rate, but to keep the negative 0.5%. In fact, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand in particular reduced its interest rate in one go, and also removed the mortgage loan-to-value ratio restrictions at the same time. With the house price rebounds in recent months, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand proposed reinstating the mortgage restrictions. It implies an agreement that the house price shower is triggered by the monetary and mortgage policies. After cutting interest rates, the world seems to revert to the inflation track. Let's go into figure 6. Here shows you the inflation rate and the real interest rate. For example, the inflation rate of Australia went up from negative 0.3% to positive 0.7% in quarter 2 to quarter 3. Similarly, in the US and New Zealand, the inflation rate have leveled at 1.2% and 1.4%. When their inflation rates gradually surpass the interest rate, it results in negative real interest rate, the right bar in each country in this figure. And here you will find that across all the 6 economies, after cutting the interest rate, all their real interest rate became negative. And New Zealand in particular got a deepest negative interest rate down to negative 1.15% because of the much higher inflation rate. It explains the strong growth in house prices during the COVID, with the highest inflation rate resulting in the lowest real interest rate in New Zealand. And therefore, it becomes the strongest growth in house prices among these 6 economies. Cutting interest rates may not be able to save the Main Street, the real economy, but it can cause the Wall Street asset market rally. It is commonly agreed that cheap loans and looser lending requirements designed to stimulate the economy during the pandemic have attracted investors back into the market. Theoretically, when unlimited credit and money flows into an inherently finite supply of property, it causes rising house prices. This is the second natural experiment since the global financial crisis in 2008. The experiments of implementing abnormally low interest rates by the central banks have shown to drive property prices crazy. In the first experiment, it was the US subprime mortgage crisis and then the European debt crisis that triggered the interest rate cuts. This time, it is caused by the COVID pandemic, which drags the global economy into a recession. An expansionary monetary policy is taken as the cure, the success in the first experiment boosts the confidence of the central banks to cut interest rates more aggressively in this round. In fact, since the US Federal Reserve commenced its normalization of interest rates process 5 years ago, property prices in many countries had leveled off or fallen just before the pandemic. Among them, the house price decline in Australia was obvious, which was agreed to be closely related to the central bank's policy of tightening mortgages. Then, when the interest rate is cut to historic low in early 2020, the house prices go up again. This kind of switching on-off text is a kind of interventional approach, just like an experiment across different countries provides more convincing evidence than either a cross-section analysis or a time series test. It also acts as a critical test on the four alternative hypotheses. That's all for today.